So, today I'm talking about identity and social class. And the central question that I'm thinking about is class still an important form of identity? And it's also the question that I want you to consider when we're doing our seminars. And I'm going to talk about a few things. So first, I'm going to talk about what is class. I'm going to try and answer the question, what is class? It's actually a massive question that could take a whole year to answer, but I'm going to try and answer it briefly. What is class? Then, I'm going to look at someone you should be familiar with, Bourdieu, and but we're going to talk about his idea of habitus and social class, which is related to his idea of cultural capital. Also going to talk about subcultures and identities of different classes. So I'm going to look at each class and think about what are the subcultural ideas within that subcategory. And then finally, going to look at whether or not there is a declining significance of social class. Is social class still significant? Is the question that we're going to end with. So, first of all then, what is class? I mean, we're all familiar with what Marx said. We should be by now. Marx saw class as a result of the exploitative relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. That it's the bourgeoisie controlling the means of production and thus controlling the lives, essentially, of the proletariat. And he related that to the division of labour. So the division of labour in industrialised countries created the class system. So in Marx's theories, it was the bourgeoisie as the factory owners and the workers underneath. It's quite a simplistic view of class. You've got the upper class, which is the aristocracy. Then you have the middle class, who are the factory owners, bourgeoisie, and then the workers at the bottom. And he saw that the key division was this division between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And crucially for Marx, class is a group which share a common relationship to the means of production, i.e. how they earn a living. And that's where Marx's economic view of class comes into play. That class is based on economics and based on your relationship to the means of production. If you own the means of production, then that's an important aspect of your class. If you are subject to the means of production, if you are part of it and have to, work within that, and your labour power is essentially owned by the bourgeoisie, then that is your relationship to the means of production. And it's an economic relationship. So for Marx, class is an economic division. So, typically, and in Marx's perspective, and other Marxists and other sociologists, typically it's a group of people who share a similar occupation level, income and ownership of property. But some have said it's more than just economics. And I think we should be familiar with what Bourdieu said about how class is more than just economics, it's also cultural. So it could be education, lifestyle, taste, housing. So it can be seen as cultural as well as economic. And it was one of Bourdieu's particular innovations that I've mentioned before, saying that class is a cultural thing rather than just economic. So we can we can try and categorize classes. I mean, Marx categorized classes into the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, and the upper class somewhere up above. And we can try and do that, and it has been done. Typically, and broadly speaking, what is often said is that there are three kind of broad categories. The working class. This is a kind of a more traditional view of looking at class. I'm going to look at a more modern one in just a moment, but there are three broad categories that we could recognise in class. Working class, those who work in manual jobs. Middle class, professionals or people who work in non-manual positions in offices or elsewhere. And then upper class, the aristocracy and the owners of industries and corporations. This is a sort of a slightly more modern take than Marx's division, but arguably it's still kind of basic. And in fact, there's a little bit of a blurring of the lines between, say, upper class and middle class. That, you know, the owners of industries in Marx's idea would be the bourgeoisie, the middle class. However, if we look at, you know, owners of multinational corporations who make billions, then you could say, are they upper class or middle class? It's kind of a blurring of the lines between them. Rip the paper. Also, some have said that in the middle class, you know, working class isn't just about whether you do a manual job, whether you just work with your hands. It's been said that in the UK and in many countries, we are a service society, so our service industry is really important. So somebody working in a job in an office where they're just an administrator could also be classed as working class. So it's a lot more complex than this picture makes out. And there have been attempts over time to kind of make a more in-depth, a more logical kind of division of the classes. And I'm going to show you an example of this now. So there's been attempts to classify class in a more systematic way. So it's very complex. I mean, I mentioned to you before about how some would say, you know, teachers or professors, for example, are seen as being, you know, upper middle class or, you know, well off or very educated. So maybe they're, you know, up the top there somewhere, but actually their income doesn't necessarily match their position. So it's a really complex sort of situation. And there have been various systems of classification over the years which have been attempted. I mean, I could spend a long time talking about these different systems of classification, but I'm just going to talk about one, which is, that should say census, by the way. One system developed from the late 90s and used first in 2000, in the 2001 census, was the National Statistics Socio-Economic Classification. And that system attempted to organise people into classes based on their occupation. And it's a slightly more complex system than we've looked at already. I'm going to show you that system now. Just so you're clear, that should be an S, census. So I'll show you the system. Might be a little bit difficult to see, but it's basically got different levels here. So it's got going from never had paid work, routine occupations, which includes sort of labourers, cleaners, and so on. Then you've got semi-routine occupations, shop assistants, hairdressers, bus drivers. Lower supervisory craft and related occupations, and that's got printers, plumbers, television engineers, train drivers and butchers as examples. I realise this is quite small, so if you want to look at the PowerPoint separately to get that, you can. You've got small employers and own account workers, publicans, pub landlords, farmers, taxi drivers, window cleaners, painters and decorators. Intermediate occupations, clerks, secretaries, driving instructors, computer operators. Lower managerial and professional occupations, nurses, midwives, journalists, actors, prison officers, lower ranks of police and armed forces. Higher professionals, doctors, lawyers, clergy, so vicars and priests, teachers and social workers, and then employers and managers in larger corporations. Company directors, company managers, senior civil servants, senior officers in the police and in the armed forces. Obviously there are issues with this in that you can have, you know, sort of crossing along those lines, and actually that thing. So, for example, a farmer is, you know, low down on the list, but many farmers are very wealthy, for example. Thank you. Some, you know, teachers and social workers don't actually earn that much money. So it is a kind of problematic system, but it kind of illustrates how complex trying to divide people into classes are and how difficult it is. I suppose we could kind of call it, this is kind of working class, the last four, and then in the middle here, up to higher professionals is middle class, and then you've got upper class at the top. The people in control of these large corporations. But this is a system of classification which is based on occupation. And I'm hoping that you've seen, in terms of class, when we looked at Bourdieu, that culture also has a part to play in class identity. So, wrong way. So, occupation has traditionally been seen as a central aspect of someone's identity. So, it's often one of the first things, and this is just a basic fact, it's often one of the first things people find out about each other. That typical question, what do you do, is common. So you could say that actually occupation does form a kind of important part of identity. And it has been argued that class impacts other aspects of identity. And I'm going to go into more detail in a moment about how that works by referring to Bourdieu and similar. At a basic level, it could be said that class impacts your experience of life because of simply life chances. So if we think of class as being, if class is economic, and based on your occupation, and based on how much money you have, how many resources you have access to, then it does impact your life. So class impacts life chances. It has an influence, class has an influence on life chances, and life chances being the possibility of gaining what is desirable or avoiding what isn't. So, higher social classes, the middle and upper classes, have better housing. They have access to and knowledge of better food. They have better incomes. They are more likely to have job security. This impacts their life chances. They have a better chance to do well at school, do well at university, achieve in their lives, and we could go into it in more detail. There's a relationship between your life chances and your basically your chances of happiness, your chances of good health, your chance of having good mental health is impacted by your life chances. So, I mean, as an example of how this is in action, you can see that in 2012, 10% of the population owned 44% of the UK's wealth. So that is massive, if you think about it, that nearly half of the wealth is owned by 10% of the people. That must have an influence on how those people and the other 90% experience their lives. So if we're looking economically, then class has an impact on how we experience our lives. Therefore, if class has an influence on how we experience our lives, then it has an influence on what our identity is, how we imagine life, how we experience it, how we react to things. It has a massive influence. So, related to that, 1/5 of the population live in relative poverty. Relative poverty means poverty in relation to other groups. So they may not be as poor as somebody in a developing country in another part of the world, but they are poor in relation to other groups in society. So it's relative poverty. So 1/5 of the population live in relative poverty. So you have this massive divide here, and that has a massive impact on how all of these people experience their lives. So one example being a man in the upper classes lives on average 7 years longer than someone at the bottom. So you can see when we look at health, class has a massive impact, and that must have an impact on identity, about how you see yourself, how you see your life experience. If you imagine that you're going to live, to a certain age, or that you know what your life is going to be like, because you're, at the bottom of the pile. So even if we don't yet move on to looking at culture, what is social class? Well, social class is something that impacts on your life chances. It impacts on how you experience your lives, and therefore how it must have an inevitable impact on identity. So you can see here an example of how this is changing. This chart is a share of all income received by the richest 1% in Britain. So these are years from 1918. The share of all the income received by the richest 1% was going down until you got to the 70s and then the 80s, and then suddenly it shot up. And this is increasing, that the richest 1% are carrying on to have a larger proportion of the total income of the country. So if we're looking at income and economics as an important factor in class, it has a massive impact on how people experience their lives. This inequality, and I've said before about how identity is not just something that you are, it's something that you're not, and it's how other people see you and how you see other people. So if there's a massive divide in a country, then surely it must have an impact on identity. I'm going to talk about a couple of ideas around classes, objective and subjective. So we can say that the material differences between the classes are the objective differences between them. If something is objective, that means it is a fact without opinion. So we could say that, you could say it is a fact that people of the lower classes have less money than people of the upper classes. That is an objective fact, right? By and large, they have less money and therefore fewer life chances. So they're objective facts, income, occupation, and so on. And then you have the subjective differences are the differences that people perceive. They may not be they're not objective facts, but they are perceived differences. And that might be perceived differences in how someone from the working classes experiences their life. So their experience of their life is subjective, because it's their own experience, it's not an objective fact. So somebody from the working classes experiences their lives subjectively different to other groups. And they may see people in the upper classes as subjectively different to them. It's not an objective fact. There is no difference, genetically or scientifically or objectively between somebody who is rich and somebody who is poor. So these differences, the subjective differences, the differences that we imagine between us, may link to an identity and may form a kind of class consciousness. Our perceived differences, as well as our real differences. So you've got two things going on here. You've got real differences, as in less income, less, job security, less access to good healthcare, that kind of stuff, is a factual, objective difference between us, and that has an influence on identity. And then our perceived differences, the differences that we imagine between us, also have an impact on identity, and may form a form of class consciousness. Class consciousness being an awareness of your position in the class structure. And this makes a link to the second aspect. Oops. No, I'll do that, can I? Moving on, there were three parts. First of all, looking at what is class, and now I'm going to talk about Bourdieu and habitus. Habitus is a concept of Bourdieu's which is linked to his idea of cultural capital. Well, not just cultural capital, but different forms of capital. And what he said was that the subjective aspects of class identity, the experience of class identity, relates to his idea of habitus. And if you think of habitus, you look at the word habitus, think of it as like sort. It's not quite, but sort of like habits. Sort of. So I'm going to explain what it means. So he said, amongst many things, he said habitus is a system of schemes of perception and appreciation, or taste. So he kind of, it's not, there's his idea of taste, which relates to cultural capital, as in the things that we like. But also, the way we perceive life is important. And what he's basically saying is that habitus is the way that people from different classes understand and perceive the world. So it influences how people react to situations and to circumstances. So our habitus, the way we experience life, affects how we understand it, and affects how we perceive things, and impacts how we react to stuff. So your life experience impacts how you react to what happens to you. And this has a very real impact on your identity and your experience of identity. So, and for Bourdieu it said this is influenced by the economic situation people are in, the economic position. So he talked about how, because of maybe a lack of employment or a lack of income, people may not may react in a certain way to losing a job, for example. If you were to lose a... Yes. If you were to lose your job, your reaction to it is based on your position in the class system. Sorry about that. Yes, so it's the way that you perceive life and the way that you react to things. If you think of habitus as your habits, and also the way that you think about things, the way that you sort of consider life. Oh, I've done something.
Just doing it again. What?
Sorry, just carrying on with habitus here. So, just to be clear, they're the socialized cultural frameworks, norms, and ways of thinking which different classes possess. People think, feel, and act in a certain way which is defined by their habitus. By the way that they sort of perceive life through their cultural frameworks, their norms and ways of thinking. People think and feel and act in a certain way. Habitus is not necessarily fixed. So it's not necessarily, he wasn't saying that it was completely fixed. The way that we perceive things is completely fixed and stable. It can be subject to change, although Bourdieu kind of said that it was difficult to effect change. It is difficult to sort of change your habitus and your experience, because it's so much based on your personal, social and cultural history, that it's difficult to get out of this way of thinking and way of perceiving the world. So it relates to, I'm just going to remind you of the ideas of cultural capital. Cultural capital is the knowledge, education, tastes, leisure pursuits, clothes, behaviour, which the wealthy, or not just the wealthy, but different classes possess. You can have different. We've talked about this already. How you can have different types of cultural capital. You might have you might live in a working class community and have good cultural capital within that community. But Bourdieu was particularly focused on class, so he was talking about cultural capital as the stuff possessed by the wealthy. And again, you can use this form of capital to exchange for economic and social capital. And for Bourdieu, this offers an explanation for why class has an influence on identity. The way our knowledge, education, our taste, our leisure pursuits, along with our habitus, along with the way that we perceive the world, have a massive influence on our understanding of our identity. But it may not be necessarily conscious. It may just be our habits and our perceptions are based on this combination of habitus and cultural capital. So, is sort of Bourdieu's ideas still significant? It's important to note, I haven't really talked about this, but there are some criticism of him. His work is kind of deterministic to an extent. Deterministic because it presumes that we are influenced by our class position, and almost that we can't sort of get out of that. It's a similar criticism of Marx. Marx was economically deterministic. You could say that Bourdieu is culturally deterministic, because he believes that we are determined by culture. So it's almost like if you're working class, there's no way that you could be into opera. you know, that's deterministic. It's saying that your class determines, you know, your taste in cultural pursuits. One thing Bourdieu also did was he was particularly, I mean, he's French, and he was particularly focused on France, and the criticism of him is that he looked at what was happening in France and used that to understand class globally. So it could be slightly limited in its sort of perception of classes. So his discussion, when he talks about, a lot of Bourdieu's work is focused on the upper classes. So he talks about how the upper classes have cultural capital. But when he talks about the working class, which I haven't really spoken about, but he kind of says things like, you know, the working class, because of their habitus, because they don't have much money and they don't have much income, they don't care what their house looks like. There's an example of something that Bourdieu said. That so although he wasn't you know, he was a neo-Marxist, so he was a supporter of the working classes. Because I think he was probably from the middle and upper classes, he didn't really have an appreciation of their, you know, experience. So, and you know, the idea that, you know, that the upper classes, middle and upper classes, are the only ones who can experience, you know, opera and all that kind of stuff is not really necessarily true. But I think he's still, despite this, if we ignore, you know, some of the limitations of what he said are true. However, his fundamental kind of ideas about the world and class and cultural capital are still really influential. Because he acknowledges the power of culture in class identity, which wasn't done before, and is still sort of considered now. It's still something which is a powerful concept now, that culture has a part to play in your class identity. So, in a moment, I'm going to look more closely at that idea of culture and class, and we're going to look at class subculture. So I'm going to go through some of the classes and just have a brief examination of some ideas around the subculture of classes. The idea is people are socialized into class identities from a young age. They identify with different aspects of their class subculture. And what I'm going to talk about are 4 broad categories of class in this example, obviously bearing in mind that it's not, you know, as simple as, you know, 4 categories, as we've already said. So I'm going to look at the upper class, the middle class, the working class, and then the underclass, which is a concept which has been developed relatively recently. Obviously, bear in mind that this is an overly simplistic view of the different classes, but it's a good kind of schema or model to use just for simplicity. So looking first of all at the upper class. And traditionally, the upper class was made up of the landowning aristocracy. This is the people, you know, right? The royalty, lords, dukes, ladies, etc. So before the Industrial Revolution, you basically had a more simplistic kind of class system in a way, because what you had was the aristocracy and everyone else, more or less. I mean, there were differences, but you know, it was a little bit more, you know, just you had the aristocracy were just in control of everything, and then you had everyone else. Obviously, that's changed. The Industrial Revolution and capitalism encouraged the rise of the owners of industry and commerce. In Marx's day, the owners were the middle classes, the bourgeoisie, because he still recognised that there was an upper class. When Marx was writing, there was still like the aristocracy, there was still royalty and lords and ladies and stuff. They still had money and influence at that time. They have less now, so they had money and influence at that time. And then the owners of industry came in, and they were the bourgeoisie, like the middle classes, and then you had the proletariat, the working classes. What has happened now, in the modern era, or probably the postmodern era, is that these owners, some of these owners are no longer the middle class, really, because you get people literally who own massive multinational billion-dollar corporations. They're not aristocracy. They weren't born into it, or they may have been born into it, but not, they're not lords and ladies. But they are, they own a huge amount of the world's wealth and the country's wealth. So you could include also wealthy sports and media stars. I mean, that's an interesting thing. We've talked before about, footballers. Footballers who earn £200,000 a week, which is essentially just playing a game. They earn £200,000 a week, so they're in the upper echelons of society, but without the kind of cultural capital to be there necessarily. So in the upper classes, they're kind of subcultures, close relations with people of similar backgrounds, as in, the very rich often stay together, the upper classes sort of stay together. Secondary socialisation happens in private boarding schools. Eton, Harrow, Oxford and Cambridge. I don't know if you're aware, but most of the members of the cabinet went to some kind of private school, Eton or similar, and then on to Oxford and Cambridge. So, although it has been said that the middle classes become more important, the upper classes are still, they still hold a massive amount of power in society. They obviously have a large amount of cultural and social capital. A huge amount, on a huge amount of high quality social and cultural capital. Literally, it's people you can become a politician in a high position of power based on the fact that you went to school with somebody in the same place. So they have a huge amount of cultural and social capital. And then there are cultural and social events associated with this, the upper classes, like trying to think of an example.
Be like networking events, sort of.
Sort of networking events. Well, I was thinking like things like Ascot and that kind of thing, polo matches and high class occasions and royal weddings and all of this, that kind of thing. Yeah. I also want to briefly mention the super rich. The super rich. There's been an increasing focus these days, as people have become aware of inequality. There's been this focus on the super rich, like stupidly rich billionaires who own a large proportion of the world's wealth. Although they're small in number, and they're not homogenous, so they're not all homogenous meaning all the same. They're not all the same. And in fact, when you're talking about identity of groups of people, they are a small group of people. But I think that what's important about our continuing awareness of the super rich is, if we say that identity is what you are not, if we perceive that there is a small group of people who have, a ridiculous amount of wealth, that colours our own experience of our class identity. That makes our own experience slightly different. And it makes us aware of inequality, and it makes us aware of our own position in that sort of in society. I mean, we could sort of look at some. This is the image that I use. This is a good illustration of it. You know, many people these days are aware of the fact that, you know, this is basically the situation that we live in. You know, the richest 1% have a lot more than we do. So this, you know, these people's knowledge of this system obviously affects how they experience life, how they understand their position in society. So I think although the super rich, there aren't that many of them, the fact of their existence has a huge influence on the rest of the world, and you know, and a huge amount of inequality. It's interesting actually. The super rich are they're not often studied in sociology or other ologies because they are a closed group. It's very difficult to get access. One thing that sociologists talk about when they're doing research is access. They have to talk about a gatekeeper. You need somebody who's going to let you into a group. It's very easy to go to a gang on the street and say, "Hi guys, I'm doing a piece of research." Well, it's not very easy, but it might be a little bit easier, in theory, to talk to a gang and say, "I want to make a documentary about you, or I want to write about you, I'm really interested in you." You can imagine them saying, "Okay, oh yeah, I'll talk to you about that." Whereas the rich kind of close it off. There was a study done recently, which there was a documentary on the radio about it, where a sociologist went and lived for years on a super yacht and did research into the experience of billionaires who live on these ridiculous super yachts. You know, the super yachts that are the size of a small town. So I might see if I can get that for you. It's quite interesting. So the super rich. So the middle class then. Middle class is a large class. They form a large sort of proportion of society. It's difficult to differentiate and to kind of work out. There are lots of people who say they're middle class, but maybe don't fit into the traditional idea of what middle class is. So it's a varied group. So there are many groups within the middle class, or people who perceive themselves as being in the middle class. Things like professionals, doctors, lawyers, and then you've got teachers, social workers, and similar, who have a huge disparity between, you know, their wealth and actually often their, you know, experience of class. And actually, there's many people would say, "Are we, you know?" As an example, my mum says that I'm not middle class because my family, my background is my parents were working class, but you know, I went to university. So there's kind of a disjoint between that, you know, that kind of your perception of it and who your parents are and stuff like that. But many people kind of say that they are part of the middle class, and it ranges from, you know, a doctor. Sometimes people might perceive a doctor as being upper class if they earn a lot of money, but then you've got doctors who would probably be middle class, and then you've got, you know, lower middle class, upper middle class. It's a complex kind of group of people. So there is a great differentiation in terms of culture and identity amongst these groups within the middle class. It's not a homogeneous group. It's actually very divided and, you know, different. And actually, there's some evidence that there are people within the middle classes who are, I can't remember where I've mentioned this before, who are cultural omnivores. They, you know, eat. They absorb and experience lots of different kinds of culture. From, you know, they're happy to watch opera and then go and, you know, get drunk in a Wetherspoons pub. For example, you know, they take their sort of cultural leisure time and stuff from different places. So it's a lot less solid as a form of identity. So there are some, although there are differences, there are some commonalities. There are some things that are similar for them. So commitment to education, a concern with the future, deferred gratification, as in putting off pleasure for today for future gains. So deferred gratification is, if you going into education is a form of deferred gratification. You're experiencing 3 or 4 years, but you guys are doing it. You're experiencing years of education in order to get something good at the end. Not just getting something immediately. Typically, kind of a high culture rather than low culture. Although, bearing in mind that is not a solid absolute fact. So there is great variation within the middle class. Yes, so I'm just going to carry on with the middle class just for a moment more. So there was some work by Lawler who looked at how Bourdieu's ideas can be used to look at middle class identity. And taste is one way in which a middle class secures, with an S, secures and maintains its identity. So in this research that Lawler carried out, they found that many of them in the middle class look down on the taste of the working class. So there is this kind of like cultural superiority of, I don't watch X Factor, I don't watch reality TV shows, because that's just sort of nonsense for the masses, that kind of thing. So it's an example of one way in which the middle class sort of maintains its identity. People often kind of don't want to associate themselves with, being working class or even being upper class. They kind of got a certain set of ideas of their identity which they focus on to maintain their class position. But that's not to say, in fact, I haven't put it on here, but there is some research that says that people also go the opposite direction. They're in the middle class and they want to be more authentic, so they do more sort of working class things, or they have a fondness for what is typically seen as sort of working class culture, like pubs and certain kinds of food. So I'm going to look at the working class. Traditionally, those who work in manual occupations, the proletariat, in Marx's view, the traditional culture, which is perceived as being traditional in working class community, is close-knit community. The men work, the women live at home. Hard work, central to men's masculinity. A strong working class identity linked to unions and the Labour Party in the UK. This is the traditional view of working class culture. But this has changed. I mean, it's changing rapidly. And in fact, it's changed since, over the last few years. That working class culture isn't like this anymore, necessarily. So this is a traditional view of working class culture. It isn't like this for many people anymore. So I'm going to talk about So the position of the working class traditionally was linked to unions, was linked to working. Work was central to their identity, and they often identified with the people that they worked for. But this started to change, and actually people like Hoggart in the 60s said that due to job insecurity, the working class, the fact that they no longer necessarily have a job to hold on to, then they have slightly different attitudes to the middle classes, i.e. they look for immediate gratification, as in they want to get it now rather than waiting for rather than delaying gratification for a later time, they get their gratification now. Present time orientation, a focus on your life experience now rather than in the future or in the past, just focusing on having a good experience now. Also a sense of fatalism. Fatalism being that you are fated to be a certain way. You can't change it. This is what life is like. I'm going to have a crap job and I'm going to work in the mines like my dad did, and my dad died at the age of 40. That's when I'm going to die because that's what I'm fated to do. I'm not going to be able to change that. So, but the working class is changing. So, with the decline of manufacturing industries, the working class has fragmented and changed. It's less based on community attachments. Work is instrumental, not the centre of life. So traditional working class communities, work was central to life. That where you worked, if you worked in a mine, you socialised with people who worked in the mine. That was the centre of your life. You were a member of the union. You lived, often, if you worked in a mine, you lived in a mining village or you lived in a mining town. If you worked in a factory, you lived near that factory. That was your identity, was your work. But from the 60s and the 70s onwards, as the industries declined, as the factories closed, then it became not a centre of your life. Work is just instrumental, it's a way to get ahead. So there is less sense of class identity and loyalty than there used to be. Higher levels of home ownership, consumer goods, a home-centred existence. It used to be, I don't know if people are aware of the idea of a working man's club. In the UK, traditionally, working men's clubs is men who work, working class men would join a club and they would go there and there'd usually be a bar and they'd spend their free time there. These days, when he was writing, Goldthorpe et al. Were writing in the 60s, but I think this is even truer now, that people are focused on life at home. And from the 80s onwards, you had higher levels of home ownership. People used to live in council houses. In the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher allowed people who lived in council houses to buy their houses. So you ended up people who were working class, bought their house and, in a sense, became middle class. So this solid sense of identity started to break apart and fall apart. How long have I been going on?
53 minutes.
So many say that there isn't a solid working class identity anymore. There's a study by Beverly Skeggs who highlighted that though there are people who seek to disidentify themselves with their working class identity, they don't see it as important anymore. And they believe that it has a stigma attached to it, that it's not as good as other forms of identity. So people start to disidentify themselves with it. However, and this is key for some of the stuff I'm going to ask you to look at for your seminar, unlike Skeggs, some people have said that other studies have shown a continued strength in working class identity. So there's a huge variation in the results from different studies, where some have seen that many people say, class isn't important to me. Others have said, actually, it is important. It is still a strong sense of identity. So, and the other thing to note is that both of these are old. This is 10 years old. This is nearly 20 years old. So it may be that more recent studies will show a difference in class identity. I'm going to briefly talk about the underclass as a sort of separate idea to working class, although there are links between them. So the underclass then, there's been many sociologists and many theorists who have identified the underclass as a new grouping, some in a positive way, some in a sort of more critical way. So you've got people like Murray, Giddens talked about it, Galley in 1994, and some of them, to be honest, are slightly offensive, if you like. As in, there are differences in how they are seen. So as a culturally deficient group, or one which has been affected by capitalism. So if you're interested, Murray, for example, is a rare example of a right-wing sociologist. Murray is an American who is, a conservative. He's on the right of the political spectrum, which is unusual for sort of sociologists. And Murray, Charles Murray, said that the underclass, this group of people who don't work, single parents, and they all get drunk all the time and stuff. He kind of said that they were a culturally deficient group, that there is something wrong with them. However, others, Giddens and Galley and others, have said that this underclass is not a culturally deficient group. There's nothing wrong with them. It's that the changes in capitalism, meaning jobs, people have lost their jobs, people have started to people are less able to keep their jobs. Changes to the welfare system and stuff has actually created this underclass. So they're not a group of people who have who have some kind of deficient culture. Their culture is a symptom of their experience. So if you are long-term unemployed, then what are you likely to do? You're likely to drink a lot, possibly. But the difference between what people like Murray and others... So Murray would say that the reason why you are long-term unemployed is because you drink a lot. Whereas another perspective is that the reason why you drink a lot is because you are long-term unemployed. You see what I mean? There's a difference between, the perception of why these people behave the way they do. It is the underclass is a stigmatized form of identity. I mentioned stigma last time, and a classic example of that is the idea of chavs. It's become almost acceptable to to be prejudiced against the underclass or the working class. That they are somehow chavs, they are lazy, they are always unemployed, they drink, they're single mothers, they're all of this kind of stuff. They treat their children badly, all of that. And you can see it in the media, the portrayal of the working class in the media. In the UK, you may have seen newspaper stories about benefit scroungers and that kind of thing. It's like a demonization of the working class. It's saying that these people are somehow, there's something wrong with them. They're culturally deficient. So they're often demonized by the media. However, recent studies have shown that the underclass is not this homogenous rank of the unemployed. It's not just a load of people who are all sitting around doing nothing, who don't care about their work. They are actually, most of them want to work. they don't have this distinctive and unique culture. They're not just this group of people who all, they don't all wear tracksuits and are all, drink booze and, stuff. They're a lot more varied than that. And actually, the way they are portrayed is a derogatory sort of consideration of their group. So the question is their identity more ascribed? Ascribed identity is something which is imposed on you by others rather than achieved. So the idea, for the underclass, for those people at the bottom of the working class who, are long-term unemployed and, they may often be, people who are... there's been demonisation recently of those who receive disability living allowance and so on as being... It was that typical story in the newspaper of somebody who is claiming benefits for disability and then there's a photo of them walking down the street, which is often an example that the newspaper uses to say that all of these people are doing this, when this is just one example amongst many people who aren't doing it. So the idea is that their identity is imposed upon them rather than something that they choose necessarily. So there's an interesting book called Chavs, The Demonisation of the Working Class by Owen Jones, who is a left-wing socialist writer who looks about 12. But Owen Jones, he wrote about how the working class have been demonised by the media and society. And he kind of says their identity has been imposed upon them. It is an identity which has a negative connotations. And it may also be one which is resisted by many in the working classes and that by those in the so-called underclass. It's not something, people are aware of its negative connotations, so it is often something which is resisted. It is also, I would say, something which, again, I've talked about how identity can be something that people sort of choose to, turn around and use against the people that are labelling them. So I think there are people who are labelled as, chavs or troublemakers who kind of say, yeah, I'm a troublemaker. They react by reinforcing that identity. But what Jones said that was quite interesting is that he said that in society these days, you are not allowed to be racist. You are not allowed to be sexist. You are not allowed to be homophobic. But you are allowed to be prejudiced against class. It is acceptable to, have... I remember when I was about 18, me and my friends had a party where we all dressed up, so let's have a chavs party, we all dressed up as it. And at the time I didn't really think about it, but since, studying sociology and stuff like that, and growing up a bit, I thought actually that was really offensive.